So is Bitcoin about to fall off a cliff, or might there be something else that's going on? So hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. And so as I just mentioned, today I want to talk a bit about Bitcoin and where we might see it going, kind of what's going on under the hood and how it relates to other markets, and can that give us some kind of insight into what we might expect going forward. Before I get into all that, I really quickly wanted to give a huge thanks to everyone who signed up for our Polarity Digital Pro subscription service that we launched on Tuesday. We had a massive outpouring of support, very appreciative for that. So I wanted to mention that if you're interested in getting into Polarity Digital Pro yourself, we are currently having a continued discount rate, so it's higher than it was on the launch day. That was $10 a month, never going to be that cheap again. But we bumped it up to $15. We're going to leave it there for a while. Haven't really decided exactly when we're going to change that. We'll let you know. Then it'll be bumping up from there as well. But if you want to lock in at 15, as long as if you lock in there and you stay subscribed, it will never change. No matter what the subscription rises to, you'll always be locked in at that $15 rate. I also wanted to mention to those who did sign up to Polarity Digital Pro, if you weren't aware, we're going to be basically using the Discord channel that Jay over from Daily Crypto Analysis, with whom this whole enterprise is a joint venture. We're making his Discord be kind of the community hub for Polarity Digital. So I'll leave a link to that Discord in the description if you haven't already gone and checked it out. We have a bunch of free channels there and also a bunch of Polarity Digital Pro member exclusive channels over there. If you're a Pro member and you go over there, just DM either me or Jay and we can add you to the Pro members so that you get access to all of those exclusive channels. But we welcome anyone, subscriber or not, come check out the Discord. It's a great place to hang out. All right, so without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Bitcoin and some things that I am looking at. So one thing I actually wanted to talk about was comparing Bitcoin with the NASDAQ. And the reason that I want to talk about this is that a lot of people noted that really kind of throughout 2020, 2021, and 2022, there was a very tight correlation between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ. Basically, as the NASDAQ went, so went Bitcoin, generally speaking, and as went Bitcoin, so went the NASDAQ. They were basically going hand in hand. And a lot of people were talking about, how Bitcoin and crypto just trades like a risk asset. It just trades like a NASDAQ stock, basically, and just follows the index quite closely. But I want to look at this in a bit more of a data-driven approach, and especially talk about what's been going on more recently with this massive seeming divergence between the NASDAQ and Bitcoin. We've seen the NASDAQ really flying up, probably being propelled a lot by kind of the AI bubble, AI narrative that's going on right now, whereas Bitcoin is really falling off and going lower. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here, and I want to pull up the 90-day correlation between Bitcoin, so that's M1 here, and M2 here being the NASDAQ, and that's what this red line is that you're seeing here. Now, one of the things you'll note is that it tends to be cyclical, right? There tends to be these waves between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ where kind of on a 90-day rolling period, there are waves where it's going to be very highly correlated, and then these times where that correlation breaks, where you have, for example, the NASDAQ going up, but Bitcoin going down, or, or same thing here, NASDAQ going up, Bitcoin going down, kind of a thing. Or occasionally it'll be, well, actually, usually, now that I'm looking at it, it's almost always been the case that it's that kind of direction. There's rarely the case where it's the NASDAQ going down, but Bitcoin going up. It's actually usually Bitcoin going down, NASDAQ going up that creates these spikes as we're seeing it here. That's actually exactly what we're seeing here. Again, more recently, if I just zoom into this kind of more recent price action, you can see that we have the NASDAQ going up, Bitcoin going down, and that's caused this big spike downwards. One of the things you'll notice, though, is that in those times when that happens, it tends to be the case that it's not that long-lived. That you kind of get that point, and then they start going in line with each other again. You'll kind of get these deviations, and very quick the correlation goes up and becomes very high. Correlation ranges from -1, which is they're completely inversely correlated, going the opposite directions, to 1, where they're perfectly correlated in the same direction. And so it's pretty remarkable to be having correlations of 0.9 for between these two different things. It just shows how much they can move together at times. But then, as I was mentioning, as you'll notice, when you have these fall-offs from that correlation, they tend not to last super long before things catch up one way or the other. And oftentimes, like for example here in the crash that we had in 2021, Bitcoin was decorrelating from the NASDAQ, which was going up, but then it caught up. It started going up again with it and kind of went up, and then we got this move back to the downside. And so if we zoom in on the more recent price action, then I think one of the questions we can ask is is that likely to happen again, where we're getting this big deviation in correlation, where there's now, this kind of drop off in the correlation between the NASDAQ and Bitcoin? Might that be setting the stage for them to get back in line, get back in sync with each other? And of course, that could either be in the direction of the NASDAQ correcting and falling down to kind of be more in line with what Bitcoin's been doing, or it could be that Bitcoin might actually stabilize and start doing a little bit more what the NASDAQ's doing. So I'll talk in a minute about kind of the different hypotheses for each and some things that we can look at that might give us an indication of which one might be more likely. Now, the final thing I wanted to note also here, if I just bring up this flat line right around the 0 point for correlation. So 0 would be when there's no correlation between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ's price. Then, of course, up would be there's a positive correlation, down, negative correlation. One of the things I do think is just notable, though, is if you look over the past several years, really ever since 2020, it's generally been the case that Bitcoin and the NASDAQ have been positively correlated. There's only been these a few times, just a few cases, at least on a 90-day rolling basis, where that correlation has broken to the downside and become inversely correlated. You see that happening here. You also see that happening here as well. I think in this case, actually, you might argue that the NASDAQ fell further kind of than Bitcoin here, and that was what was causing this decrease kind of on a 90-day rolling basis here. But nevertheless, it's really only 2 times, and every other single time they've been positively correlated. And then this being the most deep negative correlation we've seen on a 90-day rolling basis that we have seen ever since, back here. In fact, it's deeper than this negative correlation, negative 0.5. We're currently down at negative 0.65. And just backing up, looking at it historically, it's not the most deeply low that it's ever been, but it's pretty darn close. And it's close to those levels that tend not to last very long and tend to reverse the upside quite quickly. So that's where, again, I think it's reasonable from a historical perspective to expect this correlation to reverse, for the NASDAQ and the Bitcoin to start moving together a little bit more in the coming weeks and months, because again, it tends not to be very sustainable that we see these deep dives here. So let's go ahead and talk about a couple things that might give us a sense of which one could go one direction or the other. So I want to flip over to the NASDAQ here over on TradingView. And what I want to do is look at the RSI, the Relative Strength Index for the NASDAQ. So that's, a metric that a lot of people look at, but it can be useful to kind of identify when momentum is getting super extreme and likely unsustainable, where you might be expecting some kind of correction. The RSI is looking quite overextended for the NASDAQ. We're up at the oversold levels, which are generally defined as being above 70. We're currently up at about 77, about 78 or so for the NASDAQ as I record this. And we just look throughout kind of recent history, you can see that when you get up to those kind of levels, it's tended to mark local tops. We see that there, we see that here. We see here a slowing down, though not a local top necessarily. Local top here. Here we kind of sustained overbought. Well, technically we didn't get overbought, but close to it all the way through up here. But this was a local top, etc. Generally speaking, when you get to this extreme of a level, it's indicating that momentum is maybe getting overextended. People might start taking profits, and you might expect a correction to come before too terribly long. And so if we just kind of take that into consideration, what it might mean is that if we're expecting this correlation to start reversing and for Bitcoin and the NASDAQ to start going along with each other, that could be an indication to think that maybe it's going to be the NASDAQ that starts slowing down, stops ripping to the upside like it is, that could then start to bring this correlation more into balance. So that's one possibility we have to keep in mind, we have to look at. Although notably, we hit overbought levels here and we just kept ripping. We are in overbought levels here, we just kept on ripping. So you never really know. There is that very powerful AI narrative going on right now. And so who knows what can happen with the stock market. So now to look at Bitcoin, I wanted to flip back over to our website, PolarityDigital.io, and look at one of the metrics that we have on offer in our Polarity Digital Pro subscription service, and that is our Trend Confidence Indicator. If you've been following the channel, you're quite familiar with this model. Now, one of the things that's notable with this model is divergences between price and what the TCI is doing. You'll notice, for example, that as price ripped to the upside here in the beginning of January this year up through February, that the TCI started putting in this really bearish divergence, that as price was rising throughout that period, the TCI was putting in lower highs, and that ultimately signaled weakness in the market that ended up coming into fruition with this correction that we saw here in March. Then we went back up, but then even with this rise up, we're seeing just this bigger bearish divergence between here and here. And indeed, even though price did go up to the 30K level, we then quickly just started bleeding off really a forewarning of weakness in the market was what this was saying. And I've been tweeting about this the whole time, saying that this was a concerning pattern that I was seeing on the TCI potentially to kind of moderate some of the really bullish sentiment that was happening around these times, at least for the short-term outlook. But then notably, what we can see here is that there's the beginning of a potential bullish divergence where price is really falling off, but the TCI is actually rising slightly throughout this whole period. And so what that might mean is that maybe Bitcoin's weakness, is getting weaker in a sense, to put it that way, where the downtrend might be weakening. That's one of the ways you can look at the TCI, is that if it's going the opposite direction of the trend, that might be an indication that the trend is weakening. Basically, it's becoming less confident in that downtrend continuing. So that's something else that I'm watching. And so when we look at those kind of in conjunction, I think there's reasonable arguments to be made in either direction. Either that Bitcoin will soon find its footing and be able to maybe start catching up with the NASDAQ, or that the NASDAQ might start correcting and bring it together, or frankly, both. And really, if I had to pick one, I'd actually think probably the both might be the more reasonable thing, where Bitcoin might kind of get ahead of itself, kind of correct a little bit deeply. People might get really bearish, all the shorts might jump in, and then of course there might be some short squeezes that push the price back up and those kind of things. And then there might also be some profit taking that has on the NASDAQ that creates at least a local top and has it start coming down. And that might lead us to kind of getting out of this really deep kind of negative correlation that we're in right now back to something that's more consistent with the past and maybe even getting back up to a positive correlation. So time will tell if those happens, but I do just think this is a really interesting phenomenon that's going on with Bitcoin right here, where it's really breaking from the historical convergence with the NASDAQ, at least on a 90-day rolling basis, and then start unpacking what might go on under the hood to fix it. And as I said, there are kind of three different ways of looking at it, but the one that would probably surprise me least is kind of both happening. See the NASDAQ start to level off and also Bitcoin. I've seen a lot of people out there, a lot of people who think that if the NASDAQ corrects here, it's lights out for Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is just going to go down to the nether regions. It's going to get absolutely destroyed. And it's possible, that certainly could happen, and especially if you think that that's going to be driving the correlation, that just the NASDAQ's going to fall off, then you think that negative correlation is going to continue, that might require Bitcoin to continue falling. Certainly is possible. But one of the things we also have to remember with Bitcoin right now is that we're in a situation with all the regulatory nonsense that's been happening with crypto, with the FTX collapse and all that. A lot of the really major players who are involved in both the crypto space and traditional markets, who then might be going risk on and risk off at the same time across those markets, leading to some amount of correlation there. A lot of them have probably left by now. A lot of them probably just said, well, this wasn't what I signed up for, back here in 2021. I thought things were just going to go ripping off to the upside. Should I remain exposed to this, seemingly ever increasing risky market, etc.? Maybe it's time to cut our losses and just get out and not play with that. And so I think there is some reason to think that at least for the kind of near future, that this kind of general positive correlation between the NASDAQ and Bitcoin that we saw all the way through 2020, all the way basically through now, might start to become less of the default regime. And we might actually go back more to a situation a little bit more resembling some of these past points in the market, especially these past bear markets where things are very much more fluctuating, where there's not just one constant direction of correlation between the two, but they actually can bounce around quite a bit. And it could either be because the NASDAQ's going up, Bitcoin's going down, or even Bitcoin's going up and the NASDAQ's going down. I think either of those could end up playing out. And so that's just one other point that I think is going to be interesting to watch. And so I'm going to be watching this correlation between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ to see what happens there, to see if we go right back into this regime of them always being correlated more or less, or is there more fluctuation, which might actually mean more of that decoupling, which ultimately might be a good thing for Bitcoin leading into a potential next bull market where we're not having ours just totally tethered to traditional markets, but Bitcoin can kind of chart its own course. Might actually be a healthy thing for the market longer term. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. A lot of updates about indicators and more over there. And of course, go check out the website, polaritydigital.io. And if you're interested in signing up for the Polarity Digital Pro subscription service, you can do that. Lock that in now for $15 a month.